Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about the topic of sex, drugs, and alcohol. Basically, we're going to talk about, I just thought these were important enough to specifically focus on. Like I said, we mostly already covered illicit sex. I'll just kind of review it a little bit in this video since we're in that section of the book. We're up to that section of the book. Then I want to talk about drugs and alcohol and the relationship they have to negative entities. Right, which really that includes any form of, anything that you focus on as a means of maybe trying to escape. So any type of substance abuse, basically, which can even include foods, right? Believe it or not, that's how subconscious energy works, which I'll explain. So to go over this point, like I said, this is really just review. Illicit sexual behaviors push spiritual energy away, right? So, like I said, there is a way to engage in sexual activity in a way that is holy or aligned with spiritual energy, right? And you can kind of tell based on how your subconscious responds, right? So when you're in love with a girl, right? Or when you're in love with, I keep saying a girl, but when you're in love with whoever you like, right? Whoever you're attracted to. Let's say you're in love, you feel romantic love. What do you generally when you feel all this romantic love? I'll just say a girl to make it more clear. When you're romantically in love with a girl, right, you generally have this urge, this desire to be closer to her. You want to be one with her in spirit, right? And you do that through your connection through the body, through sex, right? So romantic love is a precursor to sexual activity, right? That's the holy way of doing it, right? Romantic love feels wonderful. It feels amazing, right? That's aligned with spiritual energy. And so when you're in love with someone and they love you, your subconscious is sort of primed, right? It's priming itself now to form a kind of union with your spouse or with the girl. And when you have sex within that union and with those feelings, and so you respect this person and you feel love for them, then sex is done properly and it's done in a holy way. And we generally will do it in marriage, right? Marriage is basically a ritual related to having sex in a holy way that's blessed by God's Spirit. And so that's the proper way to have sex, and that's the holy way, right? Now, when you have sex in a way that, actually, before I go on, technically, you might say, well, shouldn't that charge spiritual energy? And it can charge spiritual energy when you do it that way. But because of the way the body responds to sex, if you have like a lot of sex, right, with the person you love, you won't feel like it's pushing away spiritual energy, but the body changes in a certain way, which dampens spiritual energy. So we talked about that. It's not sinful. Sex is just unique because it comes from the body. However, when you engage in illicit sexual behaviors or promiscuous sexual activity, right, your subconscious has an inner knowing, right? It's due to the absolute nature of the subconscious, when you express an intention to focus on sexual activity in a way that's not aligned with the way God says is holy, right, you will feel spiritual energy getting pushed away, right? So it's going to feel sinful. You will still feel pleasure, but you're going to now feel a negative pleasure. So we talked about all this already. But, so this includes, it could be many things. I imagine it's probably different for women than men, but when women dress a certain way, right? When they dress in a very lecherous, I believe that might be the right word. When they behave in a very lecherous way, when they're trying to get all this attention, right? By the way, that also comes from negative entities, right? So women, they're very tempted by attention, right? Makes them feel powerful, right? And by the way, I think I mentioned this before, that's not a form of confidence. Sometimes they'll say it makes them feel more confident. No. That's not confidence, right? That's validation. That's actually the opposite of confidence. Real confidence is when you can produce an intention to believe that expresses belief in yourself in the face of people doubting you, right? And also, obviously, when no one's around or when they're not doubting you. Validation is when you can only produce belief in yourself when other people are showing belief in you as well, and you're unable to do it when they're expressing doubt to you, right? Or in your face, or you're perceiving them to doubt you. Right? Validation is actually a form of mental weakness. And negative entities, they love when women seek validation, right? when women want, like I said before, there's a certain power in sexuality. So there's power in attention, right? On top of having that power and being able to use it to get worldly things, it also makes you feel more powerful, more of a sense of pride, I should say. More vanity, right? Through that validation. And negative entities love when that happens, right? So they can plant suggestions in your subconscious mind to want more of it, right? Now, I don't know how much that happens to men, but probably happens to women a lot more. And so they could plant suggestions in their subconscious to want more and more and more of it. And at some point, I imagine they do it to a degree where it's like they're now giving into it. So we talked about that before, how a thought itself can be sinful if you're giving in to this sort of a negative thought, or a thought that charges a negative frequency, and you're not fighting it or resisting it, and you're kind of accepting it too much, right? Then it becomes sinful, and then eventually it leads to illicit sexual behaviors, which can be how they dress, and dressing in a very provocative way, right? So that is also sinful, and a negative entity can also sort of influence or groom a woman, a girl, to engage in that behavior, which we talked about in the section on emotional possession, right? So that'll lead to behavior that pushes spiritual energy away, like I said, just in terms of how you dress. And then, of course, there's actually the activity, sexual activity, even if they upload content online. One thing I forgot to mention, which I believe I alluded to, but which is kind of silly, I will hear some women say when they go online and they upload content on OnlyFans, for example. This one woman said that she was uploading feet pics. So she says, oh, that's not wrong. It's not bad, right? It's not my problem if some people have a fetish with this type of thing. I can tell you, well, if you accept my theory, right, I don't have all truth. You ask God and Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, and you check with them if this is wrong, right? But my belief 100% is that is, of course, still sinful. That's just some silly kind of childish prevarication, like I said, that people engage in when they want to engage in self-righteousness, because they always like that little bit of sin, right? As I said, you will see them make up every excuse in the book to justify sin, because they didn't truly want the goodness of God, which is what the whole exam of life is based on, right? So she's making some excuse for, it's feet. She's just picking and choosing what counts as sinful sexual behavior and a non-sinful sexual behavior. But you can't pick it, right? God's the one who picked it, and he put it into your subconscious mind. I guarantee you, when she engages in that behavior, she feels her spiritual energy getting pushed away. But she will sort of pretend that she will convince herself that it's still good. She'll distort the context so she doesn't feel as negative, which is why they always engage in these kind of silly arguments to make it seem like they're not as bad a person. And those arguments actually represent themselves using intention to distort the context so they don't feel as negative, right? So we talked about that in book 1 with moral behaviors. So yeah, all of that stuff counts as an illicit sexual behavior. It doesn't matter, right, if you're actually showing your private parts or the sexual, what we normally consider to be your sexual parts, or if you're showing parts that are not considered to be as sexually illicit, right? Or I don't know if that's the right word. You're not showing parts that are considered to be as sexualized, right, in society. It makes no difference. What matters is your intention, right, the intent. And you're willingly providing content to help that causes other people to go deeper into their addictions and temptations, and causes them to sin and act in ways that allow negative entities to come into their life. And then that spreads and society is ultimately destroyed. So again, engaging in these behaviors, illicit sexual behaviors, pushes spiritual energy away. Same thing for men, right? So if you watch adult content online, or you're constantly sleeping with women in a way that is not holy, you're not married to them, you don't love them, then of course that also pushes spiritual energy away. And for men, negative entities likewise will plant suggestions in their mind to watch more pornography, watch more adult titles, pleasure themselves more, things like that, or sleep with more women. And all of that pushes spiritual energy away. So, So yeah, like I said, that's mostly review. We mostly talked about that, but I figured I might as well go over it again since it's in a section. One other thing I wanted to talk about, which we probably didn't cover, I was going to cover this more or less in chapter 10. There's other principles we have to talk about, but I'll just get it out the way here. The body basically soaks up sin and changes in response to a prolonged sin, right? So what I'm actually getting at there is what we talked about before. So we talked about how when you have a prolonged charge, right? So we talked about that in chapter 6 of book 1. A prolonged charge will cause a body to change in response to that charge. If that's a positive charge, your body generally will change in some positive way. If the charge is negative, which in the positive case, we see that really with the placebo effect. Now, if that charge is negative, then your body will change in a negative way. And we see that usually with some type of stress, at least in a more of a short term of the charge, but it can change in more sort of ways that you can't really just put in the box of stress or placebo effect, right? So I actually talked about that when I said how I overcame anxiety, right? So I just kept charging my body in such a way that would eventually cause my brain to change and stop charging my body at the anxiety and depression frequency, right? But where this concept also expands itself to sin, right? So not just a negative frequency. It'll expand itself to actions and intentions, or your subconscious, when you charge your subconscious in such a way that it pushes spiritual energy away, right? So sinful behaviors push spiritual energy away. And when you continuously engage in sin and charge up at negative frequencies related to sin, right? So you're charging a negative frequency and engaging behaviors that continuously push spiritual energy away. Now, of course, your spiritual energy replenishes, but it also continuously gets pushed away as well. When you continuously do that, right, in the Spirit of God is not in your life as much, right? You still have His grace, but the Spirit of God is not in your life as much because you keep sinning, right? What ends up happening is that this is my theory. This is what I believe. Your body actually, well, like I said, this will make a little more sense based on what we talk about later. But your body can absorb that energy, right? It absorbs the sinful energy, which you can call it sinful energy, or just subconscious energy that's at a low spiritual level, or there's a low amount of spiritual energy. It absorbs that energy and it changes in response to it, right? So in the same way it changes to they say it's basically the same principle. So we talked about how your body changes in response to a prolonged charge. It changes it also changes in a unique way to a prolonged charge that's sinful, right? So that doesn't have a spiritual energy. That prolonged charge can manifest itself in different ways. So it can manifest itself in terms of damaging your body, but specifically in the case of sex, it can manifest itself in terms of some type of damage to your sexual organs, but also it can manifest itself in terms of your child, right? Believe it or not, that's what I believe. It can manifest itself in your child, and it can cause them to have problems in their life, either genetically or just in terms of what they experience. It can affect their personality different ways. So this is kind of what the Bible talks about in terms of generational curses, right? We're going to talk about this in a more of a metaphysical way later in chapter 10, which we don't go over it that really too much, but it just makes a little more sense based on what we discussed in chapter 8 and chapter 10, right? So yeah, this is important. I believe that that certain what's the word? How do I want to mention it? Certain disabilities can manifest in your child, or certain just differences. Their body will change in a way that's not the way our bodies are designed, right? So sin can manifest itself in that way, right? A lot of people think there is no sin and it doesn't matter. And so, again, people are just kind of left to their own devices, and as society sort of gets destroyed from people thinking there's no such thing as sin and that God doesn't matter, right? They're sort of left to these consequences, and then children are left to these consequences in future generations, which is not good, right? And so moving on to this section, now I want to talk about drugs and alcohol. So just to read this off, drugs and alcohol lower your frequency and push spiritual energy away. So that's very important. So this is talking about basically substance abuse. Now, one thing I want to say here that's important, something that I actually learned, is that the body itself isn't actually, I don't even think it's capable of charging your subconscious in a way that pushes spiritual energy away, right? Believe it or not. It's like, I used to not know the difference between a negative frequency and a frequency, how do I want to word it? I used to not know the difference between the subconscious charging a negative frequency and charging in a way where spiritual energy is being lost. Because there is a difference, like I said. It is possible to charge a negative frequency without necessarily pushing spiritual energy away. So I used to think that they were the same thing. And when I actually went through my experience with depression and anxiety, my frequency dropped like crazy because I couldn't charge spiritual energy. Like I just couldn't charge, right? And so I felt super depressed and I felt super anxious. And I thought because I was at a lower frequency, I was going to start experiencing all these kind of low frequency symptoms, or the same symptoms that I experience when my spiritual energy is very low, which is a lot of demonic stuff, which I'll talk more about in the next video, because negative entities affect your dreams, right? So I thought they were going to come into my dreams, right? Which again, we'll talk about in the next video. And then it didn't happen, right? It didn't happen almost at all, right? It happened in a certain way, but not in the way, we'll talk about more about it later. But it basically happened in a way that is not a reflection of having a low amount of spiritual energy, which I was surprised by, right? And then I realized that no, your body cannot charge your subconscious in a way that causes you to lose spiritual energy. So no matter how depressed, like let's say you're super depressed or you're super anxious and you just don't feel any emotions, if that's coming from the state of your body, and if you're in a charging feedback loop with your body, so we talked about that in chapter 14 of book 1, then that's not sinful, right? That is a problem with your body and you sort of producing intention in response to your body. However, right, sinful behaviors or thoughts or behaviors that push spiritual energy away, those can only occur as a result of your mind. So your body's not capable of charging in a way that pushes spiritual energy away. Only your mind can basically push spiritual energy away. So that's something interesting that I learned. And so you will still experience the effects of substance abuse. So substance abuse is basically sinful. Whether you're talking about drugs, alcohol, or even food, right? So if I think in the book I use the example of ice cream. If I'm eating ice cream nonstop and I keep eating it, my body's starting to malfunction, right? So it's not functioning properly because I'm eating ice cream so much and I know it. So we talk about truth expresses itself in the form of knowledge and what you know. And then when truth also expresses itself in the form of actions, what you choose to do. When you choose to go against what you know, that is sinful. So that's another paradigm of sin. So sin, we could talk about sin in forms of something that pushes away spiritual energy, or we could talk about sin in the form of acting against that which you know. So they're basically equivalent sort of systems of looking at it. And so when you know that you're damaging your body is a temple for your spirit, it is a gift from God, right? When you still abuse your body and engage in these, you continuously eat ice cream for some negative pleasure, which is gluttony, right? You're engaging in this negative pleasure. You're saying, I don't care how much my body is damaged or that God gave me this body. I'm still going to keep eating because I like the feeling, even though it feels negative. It's a form of negative pleasure. It feels impure. That is sinful, right? The more you do that, the more you're going to push spiritual energy away, right? And so I just want to make that clear, right? It doesn't necessarily have to just be drugs or alcohol. It's not the drug or specifically the substance of alcohol itself that makes it sinful. It's the intention. You could become addicted to ice cream, burgers, right? Whatever, right? You can become addicted to makeup, right? And that's a form of, for chicks, for women, that's a form of idolatry, which we haven't talked too much about idolatry yet. We'll talk about that in chapter 10, because I just feel more comfortable talking about it in a more full metaphysical context of what it is, which we have to talk about the topics in chapter 10 to really explain it in its more full form. But those are forms of idolatry. It could be a form of idolatry to even focus that much on makeup, right, for women, and then it becomes sinful, right? So it is possible to focus on a goal. By the way, working out's the same way. You could become addicted to working out, and then that's a form of vanity, and that's also a form of idolatry. And so the more you focus on it, and you focus on that more than your relationship with God, then it becomes sinful, right? So sinful, but really I want to talk about substance abuse for this case. So when you engage in drugs and alcohol, right, and you do it in a sinful way, which basically is always going to happen if you're abusing them and you're continuously taking drugs, continuously drinking alcohol, and especially if you're living in sin anyway. Let's say you're partying all the time which partying itself isn't sinful, but if you're neglecting your responsibilities and engaging in illicit sexual behaviors, and then engaging in drugs and alcohol, and you're listening to like negative music, which we'll talk more about music probably in the section on spiritual attacks. When you're doing that and you're living in sin, you're basically charging your subconscious in a sinful way, right? Which is kind of a weird way of putting it, but you're charging your subconscious in a way where your spiritual energy is dropping, in other words, or it's at a low level. And so, when you continuously engage in drugs and alcohol in that way, right, you're pushing spiritual energy away, and then it's sinful. And then, by the way, this is another avenue in which negative entities can impact you. They can infect you, right? So they'll generally infect you through emotional possession, right? So when people continuously take drugs and continuously drink alcohol or continuously abuse whatever substances, right, they're sinning more, spiritual energy drops, these negative entity can latch onto them and infect their subconscious through this sort of mode of contact in a way, right? So we talked about how bacteria get in your body in certain ways. I think I messed up on the 4 ways, but generally it's broken up into 4 categories, which I think are respiratory. So breathing, which is the one I forgot about before. Breathing, eating, sexual contact, or blood, or skin. Something like that, right? So we talked about how those are different ways in which bacteria, viruses, or pathogens in general can enter your body, right? So same thing for negative entities. This is a particular mode in which they can sort of infect your subconscious mind, right? So they can do it through drugs and alcohol. And so now what actually happens when you take drugs, which this is very important. So to go over this point, drugs and alcohol weaken your ground state charge. This makes it much harder to resist the influence of demonic entities. So that's very important, and this is something I don't think people are aware of, right? So when people take drugs, so when they become high or intoxicated, what's actually happening? Well, their brain is not charging their subconscious at the ground state as much, right? So what does that do, right? That causes their mind to sort of become a little bit looser, more all over the place, exactly like what happens when you dream. So when you dream, your body's no longer charging your subconscious at the ground state, so it just kind of goes all over the place, right? Or when you charge your subconscious and your subconscious is in its excited state, your mind goes to its transcendental state or has a affinity for going into a transcendental state, which is subconscious volatility, then your mind is more in motion. So we talked about that effect from positive memory. So I believe we talked about in chapter 9 of book 1. So alcohol is the same. Basically, alcohol causes your body to change in that same way. So your brain no longer charges the ground state as much. Your mind gets looser, right? And so this is why when people take drugs to get high or they drink alcohol, they they have a certain kind of behavior which we just associate with being high or intoxicated. But really, it's kind of similar to when a person's in the zone, right? It's just not as controlled and it's more negative. I should mention, by the way, that I've never really done drugs or alcohol, so that was never an issue for me. Never believed in that, always hated the idea of that. I actually used to think of people even who smoke weed, which I should mention is included in this when I talk about drugs and the fact that it's sinful. But I used to think of when people smoke weed, I used to put them in the same category as like people who do cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, right? So there's no difference to me, but society looks at them differently. I've kind of changed my opinion on that a little bit, but not by much. So to me, they're all just drugs. I don't know why people generally put them in different categories. But to me, weed is as much of a drug as the rest of them. It's bad, right? So now there, of course, are pharmaceutical drugs, which do help people. And weed can also help a person as well, depending on how you use it. But when you use it recreationally, then, in my opinion, it's a drug and it's still bad. So So I don't really have much experience with this. However, this is what I believe does happen. I have been drunk before though, but maybe only a couple times in my entire life. Maybe 2 or 3 times. I just don't believe in doing it. But going back to this, when a person is intoxicated, their mind kind of enters a state that's similar to being in the zone, but like I said, is less controlled. Their subconscious isn't as organized, which is normally what happens when a person enters the zone the proper way. But their mind is still kind of all over the place. And a lot of celebrities and people who are creative, they'll actually use drugs and alcohol to increase their creativity because they're not in the ground state as much. So they get some of their positive mind properties, but not in a way that's that you would normally do it, right? So that they don't get as much creativity. And it's ultimately, their spiritual energy drops when they do that. So ultimately it is sinful. However, let's say that they're emotionally possessed, right? If they're possessed already, right, or they have a very far along subconscious infection, right, when they enter this state through alcohol, right, the negative entity, it's much easier for them to plant suggestions. Now, I should mention it's easy for them to plant suggestions in general when they're emotionally possessed or have a far along infection. But when your mind is stabilized, right, so your mind has its negative mind properties, it's not all over the place, it's easier to resist those compulsions, right? So the more strong the subconscious infection is, or the closer you are to possession, right, the compulsion from the negative entity is going to be stronger. And it's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger and more continuous. But you can still fight it, right, if your mind is... excuse me. You can still fight it if your mind is in its ground state. So you have your negative mind properties, you still have the ability to resist a compulsion. However, right, if your subconscious is not in its ground state anymore, your mind is kind of all over the place, which is what happens when people are high or intoxicated, then it's much harder to fight those compulsions, right? You don't have your negative mind properties as much. You're not thinking as rationally, you're not using as much logic, right? And ultimately, I even believe the compulsion itself will just feel stronger. It'll just be harder to resist it, right? And so, just like when you're in a dream, right? When you're in a dream, you may feel certain compulsions that are hard to resist because it's like your mind isn't all there. That's exactly what happens when a person drinks alcohol or does drugs while they're emotionally possessed. So it's a terrible thing, right, to engage with drugs and alcohol while you're possessed, right? That's like the worst thing you can do because you're opening yourself up to the influence of the demonic entity, right? And your mind and your willpower just isn't strong enough at that point to resist the powerful urges that they're going to plant in you, right? So this is why when some people take drugs and drink alcohol, it's like they turn into a different person sometimes, right? Now they're usually pretty much a bad person anyway because they're constantly living in sin and that's how they got emotionally possessed in the first place. However, it becomes way worse when they take drugs and alcohol. Some people, they can hurt others or even kill them, things like that. They can do things like that when they drink, or they can sort of engage with the R word with, usually it's women, a guy and women, or a guy and a girl that's happening with. I've seen cases where people will take drugs and start harming themselves. I've seen one case where this woman, I think it was a girl, ripped their eyes out or something like that, which is crazy, right? Or they'll just see demonic figures everywhere, and they get very scared and things like that. All of that comes from emotional possession, I believe. Now, psychiatrists and doctors, when people do that, they'll say, oh, it's just sort of random issues in the brain or something. At least that's what I believe. To be fair, I don't really know exactly what they say. I imagine, because I don't see what else you can come up with in a materialist paradigm, right? So like I said, the materialist sort of framework of how the mind works is full of holes everywhere. And so I don't know what ideas they would come up with other than to say that it's some sort of effect in the brain that science is still figuring out, which causes that. A lot of times they'll also just come up with some nonsense about maybe it was some childhood trauma or something that's manifesting itself when you're taking drugs, or just some made up nonsense, right? Because they do that to try to justify the framework of their belief system, which makes no sense. It's full of holes, right? But they got to tell people something. because they have to pretend there's no metaphysics. So there's really no reason why taking drugs in that way would just cause you to start gripping your skin, and I'm not talking about when your skin itches. I know that happens. I'm talking about when people sort of like directly harm themselves, right? Like this one woman who gouged her eyes out, right? And I'm sure there are other things they do when, like, they might cut themselves or just jump off a roof, like crazy stuff, right? When it's like they're clearly trying to hurt themselves, right? Some of this stuff doesn't make sense. Some of it, I understand, you could probably explain in terms of a delusion, but other behaviors that we have seen with people on drugs doesn't make any sense. There's no reason for them to do that just because they may be deluded by certain things. The reason they do it is because of these compulsions from demonic entities, right? You're just opening yourself up to their influence when you take these drugs. When you're emotionally possessed and then you do this, that's like the worst thing for you. You're basically telling them to just tell me what to do. And basically, it's not exactly like stage 2 possession, but you're basically saying, use me like a remote control, because I won't have the willpower to resist the powerful compulsions you're planting in my subconscious mind. So negative entity says, okay, you're right, and they do their worst, right? So very important, this is what happens when people take drugs and alcohol when they're already emotionally possessed. Now, if you're not possessed, it's probably not going to have much of an effect on you. You might even be turned into a happy person, right? That will be if you don't do it very much. But I don't think you really should do it at all, in my opinion. But another way this can happen, which I want to talk about, is it can also happen even in a sense with psychic possession, right? So when people take drugs that cause them, I believe it is possible to take drugs that'll cause you to astral project or have certain psychic experiences, like ayahuasca and stuff like that, right? And when you do that, right, especially when you're already in this state of sin, right, you have a low amount of spiritual energy. By the way, I should mention, when you constantly produce the intention to engage with substance abuse, right, which is sinful, that pushes spiritual energy away, you're giving consent to these negative entities to come into your life, specifically through the mode of the substance abuse, since that's primarily the sinful behavior, right? So when you engage in ayahuasca or DMT, shamans have their drugs, which they use to astral project and things like that. Now, your spiritual energy generally drops. At least I believe. I've never done that, but I strongly believe, and this is also based on experiences I've seen, strongly believe that when you engage in these substances and you feel your spiritual energy drop, so eventually at some point you know it's wrong, right? So that the truth expresses itself in the form of what you know. When you do it anyway, now it's a sin. You're going against the truth that you know, right? And so your spiritual energy drops, and you're giving permission or consent from negative entities to enter your life through this particular sin, right? So when you engage in ayahuasca and all these experiences and you do it in a abusive way, I suppose it's possible to do it in a way that's not a form of substance abuse, but generally, like I said, I believe when people do this, it's usually in the form of substance abuse and they're already living in sin anyway, right? Because most people aren't in a state of repentance, so they always allow a little bit of sin in their life, and so they're in a state of sin. And so when they do that, they're giving permission for negative entities to come into their life, and a lot of times they will have they open themselves up to psychic possession, right? Because when they engage in these sort of supernatural experiences through these drugs, they will definitely see some spirits or something sort of contact them, and then the spirit does exactly what I said. They go into the long con, right? So they're not going to be able to transcendentally connect to you right away, right? So they want to keep the game going, right? They want to keep the con up, right? So they'll come to you as maybe some family member or some spirit guide or whatever, and then they'll tell you some type of story, and now what happened? You want more. You've gotten knowledge, right? Because like I said, God, when he responds to you and speaks to you, it's not always super flashy, right? Some people don't like that. They like God they want to have experiences that are super flashy and allows them to believe in something without faith, right? Which is not generally what God does. Like I said, God sometimes will do it in a highly supernatural way, in a highly flashy supernatural way, but most of the time it's not going to be very flashy and it won't appear to be supernatural. Some people don't like that, so exactly like Paul Washer says, they seek a strange fire, right? So they go into these experiences and they want some experience. They got to hold on to something flashy, right? And so negative entities take advantage of that, and then they'll appear as some whatever, right? Some entity. Could be an alien. Sometimes it's an alien. Sometimes it's a spirit guide. Sometimes it's a family member. Whoever. And now, to be fair, I should mention that based on things I've seen, it might be possible that real guides or real angels come during those moments, but I think that's very rare, because if a person continuously engages in this, in substance abuse, right, then it's going to become sinful and it pushes spiritual energy away, right? But most of the time, I believe it is a deceptive negative entity, right? So they'll come and they'll speak to the person, they'll give them some flashy supernatural experience, and then what happens? That person's going to want more, right? So they take more of the drug, more of the DMT, or I shouldn't say DMT, I think that's a molecule in the brain, but more of some drug that has the effect of DMT, more ayahuasca, more of some shaman drug or whatever. They take more of it and they produce an intention to get more of this entity, right? But that entity was a demonic spirit. So now you're giving consent for this demonic spirit to come into your life and for you to sense them, right? Which is an expression of your psychic abilities. Like I said, we'll talk about that later. And so you keep getting more and more and more, right? Until you are psychically possessed. And there are a lot of people who take a lot of ayahuasca and who have believed in that and gotten deeper into New Age. And it's not just the ayahuasca. There are other things. We haven't talked about the principles we'll talk about in chapter 2, so it'll make even more sense when we get there. Chapter 10. But yeah, so that combined with a lot of New Age things they go into just draws them deeper into demonic spirits, right? And so yeah, remember, and what God will do, I remember reading, there's actually 2 experiences actually, where a person said that they were taking ayahuasca, and then boom, they just like were in hell. They fell down to hell, and all these negative entities were laughing at them and things like that. And what that is God giving them an experience to let them know they were on the wrong path. So like, that's exactly what I said. He can give those experiences when you take ayahuasca and you have these sort of supernatural experiences. He can give you a warning vision then. He can give it to you when you're falling asleep or dreaming, or he can give you some experience some other way, right? But usually, because of God's grace, he will do something that gives you a reason to doubt, right? A reason to believe you're probably on the wrong path. And if you truly want the goodness of God, you'll turn away from it and then you'll come to him in faith, right? But like I said, some people don't. They don't care, right? Because they don't truly want the goodness of God. He'll give them that experience and they'll just continue doing what they're doing anyway, having a reason to believe that it might be wrong. And a lot of times they won't even tell you that this happened to them, right? I remember there was this girl at work who, this was when I was first like studying psychic abilities and I started having these dark experiences. And she asked me about psychic abilities, how they work and things like that. And I was wondering, should I tell her about all these dark experiences I'm having? I could just seem cool, and you know what I mean? And just say that, oh, I know how to do all this. Because I actually did something psychic right in front of her. That's kind of when I was in the zone with psychic abilities, which we'll talk about later. So I kind of read her mind in a sense. And she was like, oh, wow, that was amazing. And she was asking me more about it. And I was like, should I mention all these demonic experiences I'm having? And then I did, right? So I told her about these dark experiences. Not everyone's going to do that. They're going to pretend like they're so high and mighty and they're so cool for using psychic abilities or something, and they don't want to tell you about the experiences they're really having as a consequence of these psychic abilities. So we'll talk about that later, but I believe that 100% happens too with these sort of ayahuasca experiences, right? So they'll tell you about how, oh, they had all these wonderful supernatural experiences, or really they'll just tell you how they had supernatural experiences. They won't tell you the experiences they had that seems like warnings from God to stop, right? They're going to leave that part out. So you're just going to say, oh, well, if they're so happy and this is so amazing, I want more of that, or I want that, right? Don't believe them, right? Ultimately, what it comes down to is trusting in God, right? So his truth is absolute, never changes. Always go to him, right? In Jesus Christ. Always trust in them, right? But yeah, you can look up the ayahuasca to Jesus testimonies online as well. They're all over the place. But yeah, so negative entities can use this mode of sin to infect you subconsciously and lead you more towards psychic possession. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's basically the way to connect. That's basically the connection between the relationship between drugs, alcohol, sex, has sins, and negative entities. In the next next video, we're going to talk about the connection between your dreams, or a lot of times it'll be in the form of nightmares, but the connection between dreams and negative entities. Right, but yeah, that's it for now though, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.